Hello and welcome to In Conversation with me, Jen Stout. My guest tonight is Rosa Steppanova, the driving force behind Lee Gardens, who's written best-selling books and popular columns about gardening in Shetland. Now, we stepped out of the studio for this one, and I went to speak to Rosa in her kitchen at Tresta, shortly before she and her husband James left Shetland after 46 years of life here. Here's Rosa.
I came to Shetland in the summer of 1976 and I fell head over heels in love with the place. I just absolutely had never seen anything like it, and I decided I would come back and stay here for 6 months. So I went back to Germany. You know how it goes. You have all these plans and you think you do these things, and then once you settle back into your comfortable routine, you forget about it. So I knew what the danger was, so I had to move really quickly. So I missed my brother's wedding. I missed my parents' silver wedding. And I packed a suitcase with my favorite LPs, as they were then. And I arrived here in the very last week of September, intending to stay for 6 months. Because I had also, on the way to Shetland during that holiday, first of all fallen in love with London.
There's a trend here, Rosa.
And I thought, well, let's get Shetland out of the way. 6 months up here. And maybe winter wasn't the best time to start. But yeah, and then fate stepped in. I started work at Shetland Silvercraft on the 1st of November that year. And there was this man with sort of wild murred hair and a beard. And we made this beeline for each other and said simultaneously, what's it like to work here? And then simultaneously, I don't know, it's my first day. And that murred guy was called James Mackenzie, and the rest is history. And he had just fled London. There was no way he would go back to London. So my choice was to go back to London without him or to stay in Shetland with him. And well, the rest is history, really.
We'll go back a bit then, shall we? Before Shetland.
Yeah.
As far back as you like.
Oh, where do we start? Childhood, of course. And people often ask me if I had always been into gardening. And the question is sort of yes, because my paternal grandparents had an allotment by a little stream called Elzevir, which is in a region of northern Bavaria. And I grew up in a forest, really. And it's called the Spessart, and it's the largest continuous forest in Europe. So I was allowed to water plants in that allotment and pick strawberries. So that was my sort of earliest garden experience. And it was quite an extraordinary childhood. I spent the first years of my life in a disused grain mill, a huge, sort of U-shaped, horseshoe-shaped building with a cobblestone yard inside and huge big midden. And that's where all the refugees from the east were housed after the war. And that's where my parents met. And that's where my maternal grandmother was reunited with her husband. They had been separated. And that was also where my family waited to return to what was then Czechoslovakia. Because my grandmother was Czech, her children were half Czech, and when they were rounded up by the Czech army, locked up in a school for a few days, and I always hated that part of my history because the Germans from that part of Czechoslovakia were always considered to be the most fascist and the most right-wing, and I was always sort of terrified that my family would fit this category, and so I would always kind of just deny that part of my ancestry, that part of my background. I've since embraced it with a vengeance. So they were waiting, they were absolutely sure there was a mistake had been made. Why would my Czech grandmother be thrown out of her house and lose her belongings and all that? But of course they never went back until the Prague Spring in 1968. So there was this old mill, and I can't remember how many families lived there, but there is this saying, it takes a village to bring up a child, and it was like a village. It was incredible. I had a really close friend and we had this freedom, a bit like Shetland really.
And you were there until what age?
I can't remember. We moved eventually. My paternal grandfather bought part of, there was a factory at the other end of the village that made Bakelite cases for radios and things like that, which of course was then closed down. Nobody wanted it anymore. And he bought a factory building, which was a long a bungalow. It had a sort of institutional quality about it. You went to the front door and there was just this endless long corridor and rooms on either side. So he bought that and built foundations and erected it. So he, my grandmother, my parents, myself, my 3 siblings, and an aunt and uncle moved in there. There were always visitors, there were always other relations coming. There was a large extended family that were they were always there in these 2 villages. And there was always somebody there. There was always a grandmother there or an aunt or something. Even though both my parents worked, I never felt that I was sort of orphaned or anything.
I'm really curious about that because if you were there and your family was there, not by choice, that was where you kind of were put.
Mm-hmm.
Does that still feel like, is that where you would say you belong to, your home?
Yes, I do, because I never knew the actual original home. And I was always really confused when there were endless talks about Daham, which is in the dialect they spoke at home, when we were at home. And as a child, I was really puzzled because I felt we were at home. You know, I knew nothing else. And I only learned much later that we were refugees. I got sort of inklings of it. It started with sort of bullying at school, with sort of little choruses, dirty refugee, stuff like that. And also we were unbelievably poor. And I remember sort of the mortification of pulling a handcart filled with wood through the village. No other child had to do that. It was really... And we also totally different lifestyle. We had a different dialect, which I was terribly ashamed of. It was the butt of ridicule and bullying. Oh, you how do you pronounce that? And oh, what's this weird word again? And this Bohemian dialect that we spoke is very closely allied to Yiddish. And has quite a lot of similarities with that. And I love speaking it now. I love hearing it now. And
it's still on the go.
Oh, yes, very much so. Yeah. The older I get, the more I'm sort of enamored to it and in love with it because I'm so removed from it now. All these wonderful words and also the food. I did eventually go to Czechoslovakia, but that was later. That comes much later.
What were you like as a child?
I was the weird one.
No, really?
Yes. Oh, because I was the only one in my family who was reading. There was something really wrong with me because other children played hopscotch and I would sit there turning my pages and nose in the book. I was forever reading. And I grew up in a household where there were no books. Books were seen as something, a luxury, or there was just no necessity. And both my parents read what I would sort of, call pulp fiction. My dad would read sort of thrillers or westerns, and my mother would read love stories set in the Alps. But anyway, I was the one who was reading, and I would. My father worked shifts at times. When he started, he changed his job and was working in this huge big factory that made all kinds of things like artificial fibers.
And what were you reading at this point?
Well, anything I could lay my hands on. I would read an awful lot of Karl May. I read books when I was 11 or so. They were adult books. I read For Whom the Bell Tolls, I remember. And the other one I read was From Here to Eternity. I started reading a lot of German writers as well, a little bit later. to go back to that job that my dad had and the artificial fibers. They were meant to be made into carpets, tufted carpets. And my father was allowed to bring home the discontinued lines, or when there was a color change and there was so much left on the bobbing, and then the workforce could buy them for knockdown price. And as I said, we were really poor. Like, I would be sent to the butcher for half a pound of stew, which would feed 5. Mm-hmm. And the chunks would be cut up into little slivers and that. So my mother, incredibly industrious and thrifty, bought herself a knitting machine, and she knitted jumpers for her children out of that carpet yarn. And those jumpers were so rigid, if you took them off, you could put them on the floor and they would stand up.
Wow.
They would stand up. And
what do you think when you hear people saying that ganzis are too itchy?
Well, that ganzi was like an armor. It was like a sort of almost chainmail, but harder. So I don't know what happened to all these jumpers. I wish I still had one. So by then, I was also the only one out of my class at school to get a higher education, despite my parents' protests, because girls left school at 14 because they either got married or if they were lucky, they became hairdressers. And I absolutely fought against that. It made me really unhappy. So anyway,
which one would have been worse? Which one were you more against?
Oh, either. I couldn't decide. They were equally just abhorrent, this idea, because everybody was married, and then girls that were, like, I was 12 at the time, and girls that were 16, they were pregnant, they were married, they had all this responsibility, and I felt there was no more life there was no more adventure, there was no excitement. So I rebelled, and luckily I had a teacher who convinced my parents that I should be sent to further education, which I did. So I was allowed to leave school when I was 16. I did some more later on, but that's a different story. And then I became involved in left-wing politics. And it started with, I can't even remember how I met this guy. He was called Arno Winter, a very charismatic man. And the first thing I did was I became a member of all things, an American civil rights group, which might sound really strange to you, but Germany was an occupied country. And there were American army barracks everywhere. And there was a sort of an element of cultural exchange.
And soft power, right?
Yes, well, it was quite interesting. They had film nights showing amazing films, and there was, most of them were idiots, I have to say. But there were some people who were politically engaged, and they were clever, and so there was good. There was this exchange, and then the next thing, I became a member of conscientious objectors group. That was really interesting, winning those court cases, and we had it down to a fine art eventually. And in Germany, you could then, now you can choose freely. There is still a military service, but you can do what's called a social year. It's after 18 months, and then you work in either a hospital or you work in the voluntary sector with some disadvantaged groups. Anything, really, anything. So that was that. And then it was Arno again who founded the first branch in the region of the Socialist Workers' Party, SAG, Sozialistische Arbeitergruppe. And so that was that. And then later on, I became a bit more moderate and joined the Social Democrats. My father was always Social Democrat. And I remember us, oh God, it still makes me feel upset. We were both crying when Willy Brandt resigned. God, it was so awful. 75, I got my dream job. I became the Women and Children's Worker for a German-Turkish Workers' Association. That's where I met Dr. Thoman Bay.
And where was this now?
In Germany, still in the same region, the Spessart. Yeah, still there. There was one really, really funny thing with one of those Turkish women who came and was sort of just dropped into this alien society where they, didn't speak the language, didn't understand anybody. This really good friend of mine, we became really good friends. Nermin Ülkü is her name. And she then later on, when she learned some German, and I learned a tiny bit of Turkish, she told me this anecdote. She worked in this clothing factory, and this German supervisor, whatever, like in German, du musst means you must do this, you must do that. And he kept saying muss. And of course, muss in Turkish is banana. And she kept thinking, why on earth is he calling me a banana? And then she got really fed up with that. And she sort of threw something and she says, banane, which means in Turkish, I don't care. But in German, it's banana, of course. So the supervisor said, why are you calling me a banana? And then there was this truck coming every day with Deli written on the side, D-E-L-I, which is a German brand of margarine. Mm-hmm. And in Turkish, this means crazy. And she thought that so many Turkish women were being driven crazy by this society in the work. They were picked up in these big trucks. Oh my God. Yeah. But they were dreadful things. I remember in the one factory, they had these tables up where Turkey had been divided into regions, according to which region they came from. These people were the laziest and these were not so lazy, etc., etc. So complete sort of character assassinations, and it was like phrenology, sort of regional phrenology, something really disgusting. Anyway, so that was all great, and I loved that work, and I learned so much. And then there was a change in local government, and our funding was pulled from our feet. And that was it. The whole thing fell apart. I went to Turkey then, but Elani's parents came over and we toured Europe for a bit. And then we went to Ankara, and I stayed with them in Ankara because he had to go back and do his military service. And I was meant to stay with his parents, and there was no way I could do that. There was absolutely no way I could live in that society. So I came back to Germany, and I was at a loose end. Well, and then this friend of mine suggested, she always wanted to go to England and Scotland. Why didn't we go together? So we set off, we were hitchhiking, and people always ask, how did I get to Shetland? So we got a lift with a very avuncular lorry driver, a really nice man, but he refused to take us. We wanted to go to Glasgow. To us, Scotland consisted of Glasgow and the Highlands. There was nothing else to Scotland. And he absolutely refused to take us to Glasgow. He kept saying, Glasgow is no place for two girls, or something like that. So we were stuck. We were sort of stuck in the middle of the night in some motorway, like somewhere south of Carlisle or somewhere. I don't know. I've no idea. Well, we only had one option left. They had to go to the Highlands. So we took it in turns. Every time somebody came in, one of us would go up to them, and they were all men. And we would say, excuse me, sir, are you going to the Highlands? And they all said no. And we couldn't work out why nobody in Scotland was going to the Highlands. So it was my turn, and we were tired and fed up, and this guy comes in, and I asked the question. He said no, and I said, well, if you're not going to the Highlands, where are you going where are you going? And he said, the Shetlands. And I said, all right, we go there instead. And that was it. And then we obviously drove to Aberdeen, and then he drove his car onto this big net, and net was sort of pulled around the car with his hooks and hooked into a crane, and then the car was swung onto the deck of this ship. And so we thought the car was pretty done. He's obviously, selling the car to a sort of scrap merchant and getting a new car for the journey to Shetlands. And then the rest, of course, we went on the boat and then falling in love.
That's one of the best versions of how I got to Shetland that I've heard.
Usually, I've told it so often, and if people ask, and I've told it too often, I just say, through geographical ignorance.
To be born again. To be born again. From the far side of the ocean, if I put the wheels in motion, and I stand with my arms behind me, and I'm pushing out the door, could you find me? Would you kiss my eyes, lay me down born again. To be born again. There you go, standing with the look of avarice, talking to you to let better, showing pictures on the wall, whispering in the hall. I'm pointing a finger at me. There you go, there you go, standing in the sun, darling, with your arms behind you and your eyes before. And there you go, taking care of your boy, seeing that he's got clean clothes, putting on his little red shoes, seeing that he's got clean clothes, putting on his little red shoes, pointing a finger at me.
You said that your parents would have expected you to leave school at 14, get married or become a hairdresser. But you do have this memory of, talking about politics and being very engaged in politics with your dad.
Yeah.
So what was he, were you close, what was he thinking about this life that you were leading, going off to Turkey and being a campaigner?
My dad never said very much. My dad was the quiet one. He very much, he played very much as if almost a marginal role within the family. It was my mother and the extended family, all these matriarchs that ruled the roost. My father was very quiet. He was, how can I explain it? Wonderful. I loved my dad. I absolutely adored my dad. And he sometimes got a bit fed up with me. I remember when I first realized we had this politics in common, and I could talk to him about my radical leanings and things like that, and he would listen and he would engage with me, and we would watch the news together and all that. So I was really hooked onto him. He was maybe my first mentor, somebody who took me seriously and treated me like an adult. And then I remember I overstepped the mark, and he used to go every week, once a week, to the local pub where he played cards. And they had, in Germany, was known as Stammtisch, which is a round table, always reserved for the same men. I just just jumped him to the pub, and I sat there. He didn't speak a single word to me. And that was him telling me, I want to be there. I was the only woman in the pub, and he said to me, without saying a word, I don't think we'll repeat that. Mm-hmm. And he would do things for me. He would love he showed in. It wasn't very tactile. It was done through. He could turn his hand to anything. He made things for me. He repaired things for me. A big thing was foraging for wild mushrooms, chanterelles, and he would fry chanterelles for me. And pickling cucumbers was a huge big thing, and even all these East Europeans would do that. And he would pick the tiniest for me and make little jars, especially for me. Yeah, and then they came to Shetland a lot, and he made hay rakes, and he repaired things, and my mother was terribly upset that I was so far away. And he was very far away. But, and maybe also because of them living in exile and being away from their home. And I always remember she was much reconciled when she came here for the first time and said, well, at least I now know where you are. I can envisage where you are. And my parents struck up a really close friendship with our then neighbors, the late Jimmy and Ellen Tate. They were the witnesses for our wedding.
Where was this that you had settled at that point?
Oh, well, 79. And marriage, of course, was completely anathema. No way. I also was a feminist by then. I was in Germany and witnessed the birth of German feminism. Women like Alice Schwarzer were suddenly on TV, and it was just this incredible revelation. And then getting married was, of course, no way. And we were staying in a place, James and I were staying in a place called Hecklebister, which was also known as the Tin Tabernacle. It was down the Court Road, and it had corrugated iron on the outside and V-lining on the inside with nothing in between. And it was, I think, the coldest winter ever in Shetland. And we lived with some other young people. We had cats, and I would pour out milk for these cats. And in the morning, the milk was a block, not just a skin of ice, it was a block of ice, a white block of ice. I used to wear chompers as long johns under my clothes, tied around the waist with a bit of string.
But were you happy?
Absolutely, deliriously happy. We were in love. It didn't matter. In the house, there was very little running water. So James and I would go into town once a week for a shower at the Fisherman's Mission. And then Christmas came. Oh yeah, we worked at Shetland Silvercraft. I told you that's where we met. We did the Christmas orders, and every Friday was silver polishing day, and we polished to the rhythms of Howard Lockhart's hospital program. And it went like this. This is a request for Mrs. Johnson, who has been in an iron lung for 38 years. And then they would play this jingle, keep your sunny side up, up. And stuff like that. It was totally bizarre. Wow. So anyway, we were sacked on the 23rd of December. And then we had no money, we had no food. And our Christmas dinner, we became thieves. We had some tatties and some carrots. And we walked down the Court Road and we stole a cabbage and a neep. And we had that as our Christmas dinner with a luxury condiment called garlic margarine. Oh. It was delicious. Maybe we should repeat that sometime. So that was that. And then somebody said, there is an empty house in Tresta. Why don't you try there? So we came over the hill here, and first thing we saw was smoke from the chimney. So obviously not empty, but it was. Somebody had lit a fire because the potatoes were stored here so they wouldn't get frosted. There were winters in those days. So we moved in here. We moved into the Lee in Tresta, which was then called Westerfield. They changed all the names. The woman who owned the place was not well. She was housed in hospital. And it was very, very sad. So we started becoming crofters by default, really. The woman's brother taught us how to cast peats.
James. Was this you and James or the whole gang?
No, it was James and I. There were sheep here, but there was no food for the sheep. And some of them died. It was just, it was just sad. And then James got a job with a wholesaler called Brown. And he brought home mouse-contaminated flour, lots of fruit and vegetables. And the sheep developed chronic coughs from eating this flour. And I remember finding one with a grapefruit, half a grapefruit stuck over its nose, but they all survived. Yeah. They survived and they had lambs, then we did tatties and we just became crofters. And then, of course, we had no security of tenure. And the garden started with a little patch here, a little patch there, and then it was again, oh my God, we have to move. Can we stay, can we not? It was very nerve-wracking. And then, I can't remember how this came about. I think it was probably discussions with Jimmy and Ellen next door. They said, why don't you see if you can get a subtenancy? And then, of course, there was also the laird here. And, we thought out of politeness, we had to, as soon as we'd moved in, we had to go and introduce ourselves to this laird. And there were these two quite formidable looking women, one quite old, and we were really pleased that James had a job and we didn't have to go to them and say, oh, we are unemployed and we live on benefits and things like that. So we walked in and they listened to us in a stony silence. And then one of them said, and when will you be prepared to move out again? And that was it.
And were you prepared to move out again?
No, we were not prepared to move out. Anyway, so this possibility of the crofting tenancy came up, and we were told it would be much better. You won't have much of a chance, but you might get it if you marry. So we decided to get married, and that was that. I remember we took a taxi from the ceremony. We had I was by then gardening. I was the gardener at Booster House. We took a taxi and we got to Booster House to have this reception, and we'd lost the marriage certificate.
In that time?
Yeah. It was gone. And then we had a traditional heimfair. We got married on the 23rd of May. 23rd of May, 1979. And then we had a heimfair in August. My parents came up. James's parents came up. It was just incredible. Some colleagues of ours who'd worked with Shetland Silvercraft, they were in a band, they played the music. James was by then working for the Water Board, and his colleague Andrew Henry in Baxter took off a hill hog. And in those days it was like you gave somebody a bag of flour and they baked whatever. It was unbelievable. It was just like everything came together just by magic. And it was a great wedding. That was how long ago? And we're still married. So that was that. And then, of course, the gardening bug bit.
And by this time, I guess you were going to stay here. You didn't have qualms about that. You were settled here.
None whatever. But what had happened in the meantime, this sort of, I have to say, this empty landscape that I'd fallen so in love with, this green, this large expanses of green and these white horizons that had so attracted me because they were the antidote to this little Spessart village with its vineyard and this forest with 1,000-year-old oak and beech trees with rabid foxes we were terrified of. A place to hide and to run away to. You know, if like when children want to run away, where do they run to in Shetland? Everybody sees them. Sorry, but you know, if I fell out with my mom because I'd gotten the wrong thing from the shop because I'd been reading on the way there and on the way back, and she would shout at me, I would go to the forest and decide I would stay there all night. But
go to the banks, Rosa. Go to the banks.
Oh, the banks, is that where you went? And then I decided I would stay away all night, so they would be really sorry and come looking for me. But I was too scared of the rabid foxes and came back. Anyway. And then I longed for that. I felt exposed here. Yes, I missed that. I grew up in a forest, in a real forest. And so I tried to recreate, to begin with, my mother's garden here. Planted stuff, and we brought back hazels, and I brought back an elder that is still here. And that was planted the year we got married, I think. Or maybe a year later or so. So that was the start, and it was trial and error. And then the neighbors came. Wonderful neighbours. Joanne Nicholson down the road. Jimmy and Ellen's daughter, Linda. She was the first person who came to visit us, and Ellen told me later she came running home from school and she threw her satchel and she said, Mom, hippies have moved into the Lee. Can I go and see them? So Linda came. I remember she came on a Sunday morning. She was here all the time, Sunday morning, and we'd slept in, and James said to Linda, oh, did you see if the fire was still on? It was just a smoke. And Linda said, I thought there was a peregrinal rig for the lumen. I said, sorry, can you repeat that? And it was the same in Shetland Silvercraft. My lovely, lovely foreman, Jimmy Moncrief, wonderful man, with the patience of a saint. He taught me how to solder silver, and he would explain it to me. And I would listen with all the concentration available to me, and I didn't understand the word, and I would say, sorry, can you say it again? And I didn't dare to ask him a third or fourth time, so I pretended. Yeah, all that. And it was a bit like I understood how Naramin felt in that clothing factory. And then this gardening thing started. And I became a member of the Lerwick Gardening Club, and they had a tree sale. And I bought this birch out there, one of the oldest. The first trees were planted 81, 82. 2 Japanese larches. And of course I planted sycamore, which was then considered to be the only tree worth growing for shelter. And it doesn't create shelter. It's far too widely branched. It takes half a lifetime. But this gardening bug had bitten me.
Is that one of the many tree myths that you've overturned?
Well, yeah, but it was like Norse was seen as synonymous with cold and bitter cold winters. So there were all those books that I read, and I went to these nurseries on the mainland. I'd started reading about plants by then and made lists of plants I wanted to grow here. And the advice I was always given, I hate the word hardy. It's, oh, you need something really hardy, and is it hardy? I wanted to grow rhododendrons, and this Aberdeen nurseryman said, oh, the only ones that'll survive with you up there is the hardy hybrids, which are the least successful in Shetland. They originate from what is known as a continental climate. In sort of gardening terms, there are basically two climates. There is the continental one, with hot summers and cold winters. And the plants need this long, cold dormancy, and they also need these long, warm or hot summers to ripen the wood, to flower and to set seed or to fruit. Maritime climates have cool summers, mild winters. I was barking up the wrong tree for years. And also, going back to the neighbours, Joanne Nicholson and Linda, lovely Linda, came with plants I'd never heard of or seen, called Wandering Sailor, Australian Daisies. I can't remember all the name. Peruvian lilies and all these things. And I planted a border out here. And next spring, not a single thing came back up. And I thought, well, if they grow there, why don't they grow for me? And I'd noticed there was all these puddles all winter long. On a Sunday, we decided to investigate. And there was James and I, a friend was staying with us, Jimmy from next door. There were 4 or 5 of us. And we started to dig, and we put a fork in and we got stuck. And then we found out that the house had been given a new felt roof. And the old one had just been put down there. And there was like a spade depth of soil had accumulated on top. It was underneath, so it was completely waterlogged. So after that, things improved a bit. And then I met Johnny Copeland, the late Johnny Copeland, up in North Maven, a place called Armoria, which is the botanical name for sea pink. He became my guru. And the sort of turning point came, he was a member of the Scottish Rock Garden Club. He had the most wonderful selection of plants. Again, in a sort of things I couldn't grow and I didn't understand because I was gardening and I'm still gardening on a peat bog. He is gardening on this sort of desirable thing is called a well-drained loam. So again, lots of the things that he grew, I couldn't, they died. So I started building all these raised beds, you know. The only purpose in life that a wall serves is you build a raised bed against it. And the plants get the warmth from the wall and all that. And then he was a member of an organisation called Scottish Rock Garden Club. And there was one year when he decided he would not use their seed list. He would give it to me. And he said, but Rosa, no pictures, no common names. It's just lists of Latin names. And I said, I'll do it. I can't remember who told me to get this book. It was called The Harkness Seed List Handbook. It's a very primitively bound, and it was actually typed pages. All they had was Latin names, the country of origin, height, spread, flowering time and colour. And that's how I started. And from then on, according to James, I spoke Latin and Greek in my sleep.
You didn't study horticulture? You learned this all yourself?
No. The only other thing I did study in Germany, and I hated it, I did a sort of diploma thing, which I scuppered. I hated it. As a bilingual secretary. It was just a brainwashing course. It was just horrendous. They asked questions like, somebody on the shop floor has had a bad accident, but you've been told by your boss not to disturb him. What do you do? And the correct answer is you never disturb your boss. And I thought, blast that, you know. Oh, it was really awful. I just couldn't do it.
I'm trying to imagine you doing this course. It's really funny.
I couldn't do it. And the really funny thing was, you know, when I did this higher education, and I remember my granny, but they wanted the best for me. And my granny said, just imagine, you're going to work in an office, you're going to be warm in the winter. Because they worked in the fields, they were farmers, they were peasants, you know. And so in a way, I did follow that tradition, and we grew all our own vegetables. And it just all took off. It just became this all-consuming passion.
So we're just sitting here looking out the window at thick wood, as it seems to me. Describe how it looked then.
Well, there was the view to the sea. There was the dry stone dike here, and that was it. Oh, there was one which in Shetland terms would be classed as a tree. It was a New Zealand daisy bush that came down New Year's Gale, 90 to 91, when that couple was killed up in Unst, who were in that hot, horrendous, yeah.
When you were trial and error, I guess, to see what would grow and how you would do these things, did you ever really just lose your patience with being in a place where winds like that could happen and winters like that could happen and the soil's not so good?
It was never patience, it was heartache. It was absolute heartbreaking. And it was also the sheep. I sometimes felt, the sheep would go in the garden and ruin everything. And then there was a gale. I mean, everything was coming into flower. Everything looked amazing. Those summer gales were so devastating.
You've established the gardens. It's the early 90s. You adopt your daughter, Anna. Some hard times for a few years.
Yes. Now, Anna was 89, and this is really the fault of Bernie Golightly, one of James's closest friends. And of course, the wall came down, the Eastern Bloc, all this. And then what came out in the wash was the sort of crazy Ceausescu policy, where there was no contraception allowed, no abortion was outlawed.
In Romania.
In Romania, and there were all these children abandoned in so-called orphanages, and Bernie said, why don't you go and get one? And everybody else, why don't you? So eventually I went, and I thought, there's no way, how can I go and get a child? Do I go from cot to cot and say, and make a short list or something? So, but I went, I said, I do what I'm told, I go. And then our solicitor, horrible man, he always said, we have names for women like you. He didn't like strong women. And he took me to a place called Giurgiu on the Bulgarian border. So I was led into this room, and then this nurse came in, all dressed in this blue uniform, and she held this baby, and she gave me this baby. She held out this baby, all swaddled in white, and I picked up this baby, and it was like a loaf of bread out of an oven. She was so hot, but also really wet. And then I held her out to Ivan, and he wouldn't touch her. He just went like this with his hands. And then the nurse laid her on this table and changed her, took her nappies off and all that. And then this baby looked at me and held her hands out to me. And that was it. That was it. I didn't have to choose. She chose me. It was So eventually she came here, and Anna was like a whirlwind entering our lives. My God, what a child. Woof. Anna was something else. She really was something else. She still is. I remember I always said, oh, well, it'll change nothing. We'll just carry on as normal. And it was a really steep learning curve.
Yeah, just a child,
Yeah. I remember once there was the Liptons, where Boots is now, and Anna was obsessed with babies. And we went shopping in there, and it was just like, you went around in a circle with sort of an oval to go to all the shelves, and then I couldn't find Anna anywhere. And I searched the whole shop, I went everywhere. No Anna. And she was wheeling a pram up towards the Fort Charlotte. She'd stolen a baby.
Wow. How old was she?
3 maybe, something like that. And she was absolutely incredible. I still wanted to do different things and wanted to learn, and I became a volunteer for what was called the Shetland Drugs Project. And we were in the upstairs above the Lotties. We had a drop-in there and all these things. And then Shetland Health Board, they were running counselling courses. I did the diploma. Eventually, I did the certificate thing, and then the diploma. Having been a complete skeptic initially, and my sort of attitude was counselling and psychotherapy are for poor sorts who have no friends, and it's all psychobubble and brainwash and you name it and things. And what happened was a woman called Margaret Jarvie, she became known as the mother of Scottish counselling, formidable woman, and she took me on. And we sparred, but eventually we got on, and it was total game changer for me. I did work as a counsellor and psychotherapist. I did more training. I did bereavement training and all that. And it was Margaret Charvey who said, he said, Rosa, I see, you can't decide between growing plants or growing humans. And I said, growing? And he said, yes, because what you do in either capacity, you provide conditions for growth. And it was such a revelation. And so I tried to combine the two. I worked for, first the Talks Project and Women's Aid. And in between, I worked for an organization called WOW down at the Link Up thing. I started writing, of course. I'd forgotten about that. Yes, I did a column for the Shetland Times and all kinds of things. And then I wrote this book called The Impossible Garden.
How did that come about? Had you been wanting to do that for a while? And
I just loved writing. I loved writing. I loved writing. I was reading like crazy, of course, and it was all gardening, but not gardening manuals. I hate them. But they're incredibly useful. I've just written one, I'm sorry. But what I was reading was horticultural literature. I was reading Marjorie Fish, Best Chateau, Vita Sackville-West, and above all others, I was reading Christopher Lloyd. He became my guru. I just worshipped the ground that man walked on.
Why?
He was the breath of fresh air. He cut through all this crap, all this prescriptive thing. You must sow your things on the 3rd of January, and you must do this, and then you must do that. And he said, use your common sense, look at your plants, learn about plants, learn where they come from. Best Chateau was the one that said, forget about all that. Find out where your plants have originated in the wild. What kind of conditions, high altitude, low altitude, wet, dry, shady, and you can't go wrong. And Christopher Lloyd really rubbed up the whole sort of horticultural establishment the wrong way. And then I got this phone call. And the voice at the other end said, this is Christopher Lloyd. I was wondering if it would be convenient for me to visit your garden next week. And I thought, pull the other one. Somebody obviously playing some massive hoax, you know. So I said, I'm terribly sorry. I don't have my diary to hand. Can I call you back? And I thought, I got you. He gave me the number. I phoned the number and some woman said, Great Dixter House. It was Christopher Lloyd. My guru had phoned me to visit my garden. And not only did he come, he came with Bess Chateau, my other guru. And Bess and I, we never sort of became friends. It was circumstance, but Christo and I became friends, and we used to stay with him. Again, I must go back to Anna. Christopher Lloyd, when he was a little boy, he met this amazing woman called Gertrude Jekyll. Huge, big, influential gardener. And that's, she sort of maybe taught him a bit and all that. So one time when we were staying with Anna there, we were packing up the car and Anna went into his study and didn't come out again. And he didn't like people to disturb him. And I said, he's talking to Anna about gardening. So the whole way we drove on to James's parents, and that entire way I said, Anna, what did he say? What did he say? She wouldn't say it. And then eventually she got so fed up and I said, Anna, please, what did Christo say to you? And she said, he said, shut the damn door. And that was him to a T.
It's a wonderful thing, isn't it, when you plug away at your own obsession and find people that you emulate, and then suddenly you've created something that's so extraordinary that those very people want to come and see it, And of course you get on well.
I became a member of this, I was in awe of all these people. Another really amazing person we met is Dr. Nolte Henry, the taxonomist from the Botanics in Edinburgh. Tony Schilling, who was curator of Wakehurst Place and the Royal Botanic Gardens of Nepal, and all this stuff just sort of came. So I wanted to write a book in that tradition, which I did, and it became this unbelievable sort of cult. It became a sort of cult publication. I was asked in Shetland Times so many times, could I reprint it? I wouldn't. So I had to write another one, a dull one.
A manual.
Yeah, I've done the manual now. It was amazing, the book. James and I, his mother lived in Surrey, his parents lived down there. We used to go and see them. And we used to go to Wisley, that famous RHS garden. And we walked into the shop There was my book on the same shelf with Christopher Lloyd and Bess Chatto. And I mean, that was such reason to celebrate. And then I got wonderful reviews. The book pushed Seamus Heaney into second place in the Guardian bestseller list for 2 days.
Ooh.
And I always meant to tell him that, but then he died before I got round to it. So it was really rewarding. But at the time, I didn't know and all, but it got good reviews. Apart, it got the most damning review in the New Shetlander of all places.
Things really took off
Yeah.
with the book.
Yeah.
And there was television and there was all sorts
Yeah.
going on. You were writing a column.
Mm-hmm.
And very, very, very busy from the sound of it. Counselling and involved in the New Shetlander, all sorts.
I was also a member of the Labour Party. Yes, there was a lot. I think sort of, love and enthusiasm and passion, they create their own momentum and they create their own fulfillment and things happen. I think if you're really passionate about something and you apply yourself to it with all you have, with every fibre of your being, you can't possibly not succeed. I'm a huge believer in that. If you do that, the rewards just come, and yeah, it's wonderful. It's just still wonderful to be part of all that, part of this international sort of community, and also getting plants that I would have never dreamt of ever growing. Look at this little darling here. Look at this. It's just a little bud.
I thought it was like a sprig of rosemary that you were using for cooking.
Well, this is not like a rosemary flower. You're quite right. It looks very much like a sort of linear leaves. Mm-hmm. And this is the little sister to the national flower of Chile. And it's called Felicia Magellanica. And it grows in really deep shade. So we're going back to the forest again. I would have never dreamt of being able to grow something like that. We've got one of the mega herbs from the subantarctic islands. We've got Hoherias in flower. We've got Chilean lantern trees. We've got also the other thing that of course comes when you dabble with plants. We've got our own strains of Canadian and American trout lilies, wonderful things. We've got our own strain of Candelabra primulas in all the colors of the rainbow. There is also going to be a tree peony called Red Rosa, which hopefully will hit the market eventually. So all these things have happened, and I think I hate this sort of thing that it's hard work. It was never hard work. I used to be out in the garden in the summer for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, and still had the energy to get up the next morning and do it all over again. It's passion, it's love, it's enjoyment, it's creative energy and just pure creativity. I used to be out there on a Saturday with my radio listening to opera live from the Met in New York, doing my plantings. Some of them with the help of a little carver. And then we called them carver plantings.
I love the idea of you outside gardening, listening to the opera,
Yes.
drinking cava.
Yes, one has to garden in style, Jen.
Yes. You've created something that has brought lots of joy to lots
Yes,
of people
I
who've come
hope
to
so.
visit
I
the
do
garden
hope
and
so,
inspire
yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And now you're passing it on to someone else.
Yeah. Well, yes, but the wonderful thing was meeting so many people, so many like-minded people. And Shetland gardening has changed. And there's so much more accumulated knowledge here. And so many gardeners who know what they're doing and having the passion and all that is really taken off. I can't take the credit for all of that, but I think I maybe have helped in a small way. I got a lovely letter the other day from somebody who heard we were leaving, and I was moved to tears, just sort of thanking me for, having made Shetland greener and more colourful, things like that. It's really rewarding, and also sort of knowing that having given something back. Without Shetland, I don't know what I would have done. I might be married to Dr. Toman Bar. I live in Ankara.
How are you feeling at the moment, thinking about all of this, all this time that you've spent in Shetland and everything that you've done and how it's changed you, of course?
Yes. It feels sort of complete now, I think. And I've always had this ambition to make a garden in a different climate. And there have been attempts. We fell in love with a house in Italy, James and I, when Anna was wee. That never came off. And I did for a while flirt with the idea of going to Czech Republic. I drove through it and I was just absolutely in love with it. It was like I could sort of connect with, I mean, half my genetic makeup is there. There was something I could relate to. But it's making a garden in different climate. But also, people come and go. And since we came here in the late 70s, mid-70s, so many people that we made friends with have left. And now we've connected with so many friends. It's unbelievable. Got a card the other day from somebody we hadn't seen since 81 or something. Suddenly out of the blue, and we're going to be nearly neighbors down there. And so there is, I said earlier on in another interview, I want a third life. And I don't know for how long that's going to be, because I'm quite decrepit now, as you can see.
You're very far off decrepit, Rosa.
Well, I like describing myself as decrepit. I feel really buoyant because I don't want to go into the sadness of we've been spending more and more time south. We don't give the garden and all this what it really needs. And it's not good to be torn between two places. And of course, going back to Anna, our little, not so little anymore, whirlwind. Once we're on the mainland, we can jump in the car and pay surprise visits and see what she's up to behind our backs. All in all, it's been some experience being up here. Never ever thought this would, I would stay for that long.
And where you're going to, is that a bit more like the forest?
There is a forest there. There are some small forests there. There is one called Tensmuir in the east of Fife. Geography, as you know, is not my strong point. And also new plants, different plants and gardens I want to see. Go briefly back to the other sort of form of growing I sort of dabbled in for a while. When I first came to Shetland, a house was pointed out to me where allegedly this couple lived, and she lived in one part and he lived in the other part. And they allegedly hadn't spoken to each other for 48 years or something like that. And then this subject sort of came up during my training, really. This sort of lack of conflict solving, that people just sort of didn't speak and fell out and sulked and gossiped. I think Shetland has come a long, long, long way. And I think these conflict solving skills, and in order to solve conflict, is having conflict, actually sitting down and talking and being open and being honest and solving issues. That is beginning to emerge up here. And that gives me as much pleasure as all the plants that I've grown to see that happening.
My thanks to Rosa Steppanova for her time and for her music choices, which were Mozart, Van Morrison, Beethoven and Schubert. Thanks for joining us.
Your smart speaker.
And on BBC Sounds.
BBC